Hello and welcome back to Science of Medicine. Today I want to discuss the adrenal glands, a set of glands that sit atop the kidneys that are responsible for several hormones that are part of the endocrine system. The adrenal glands are made up of an outer cortex which produce three steroid hormones, principally aldosterone, cortisol, and DHEA, and an inner medulla which is responsible for production, amongst other things, of epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are part of the sympathetic nervous system, which we talked about in an earlier video. Now, in the cortex, there are three layers: the zona glomerulosa, which will produce mineralocorticoids, in particular aldosterone; a middle zona fasciculata, which will produce, amongst other things, cortisol; and a zona reticularis, immediately adjacent to the medulla, which will produce androgens, in particular DHEA. The inner medulla, as I mentioned, will be the production site for epinephrine and norepinephrine, principally. Now let's start on the cortex hormones, the zona glomerulosa. This is producing aldosterone, a mineralocorticoid. And you remember from previous discussions in the renal system that aldosterone is essential in the distal cortical tubule. And so the distal convoluted tubule, actually the principal cells and the intercalated cells both respond to aldosterone. In both cases, they will bring a sodium in, but the principal cells will actually release a potassium, and the intercalated cells will actually pump protons. There are different diseases associated with too much or too little aldosterone, and these are not terribly uncommon. Hyperaldosteronism, also called Conn syndrome, is going to produce hypokalemia and metabolic alkalosis, and this is mediated through the DCT, the distal cortical tubule. And remember that if you have aldosterone present, you will exchange a sodium. You'll bring a sodium in and get rid of a potassium, or bring sodium in and get rid of a proton. That's where you'll get the hypokalemia and metabolic alkalosis from. It also will produce, in this hyperaldosterone state, hypertension. On the flip side, a deficiency, hypoaldosteronism, where you cannot make aldosterone in the adrenal gland, leads to a disease called Addison's disease. And this leads to hypotension, hyperkalemia, and metabolic acidosis, the exact opposite of the excess or hyperaldosteronism. We'll talk about Addison's disease when we talk about cortisol here in a few minutes. Now the middle layer, the zona fasciculata, produces cortisone, or cortisol actually is the one that I'll talk about. And this is actually mediated through the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. You may remember that the hypothalamus will release corticotropic releasing hormone, which will then stimulate the release in the anterior pituitary of ACTH. Now technically it's synthesized as a precursor, which is POMC, and that's cleaved to make ACTH and melanocyte stimulating hormone. The reason that I bring that up is going to be essential because it will show certain disease processes when I actually produce an excess of that MSH. And then also in the adrenal cortex, in the zona fasciculata, that will produce the cortisol and other similar molecules, which have many effects on stress and metabolism, as well as maintaining blood pressure. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the glucocorticoids, in particular cortisol, will have a negative feedback effect on the anterior pituitary cells that make ACTH, as well as the hypothalamus, producing CRH. So if I have too much cortisol, an excess, I could have an excess of cortisol because I am producing too much in the adrenal gland, but I could have a secondary excess, which would be from having too much ACTH produced, which then would stimulate the production of cortisol, or tertiary, exceptionally rare, will actually lead to an excess of cortisol by stimulating excess ACTH, because you're actually having excess CRH being produced by the hypothalamus. And there are many signs of cortisol diseases. Generically, these are referred to as Cushing syndrome. The face become very round. We call that moon faces. There are stria, which are these pinkish purplish stretch lines that you see here on this image. This is a female. You can also see excessive hair growth on her chest. On the other hand, a deficiency can be from an inability to make cortisol, and that's called Addison's disease, as I mentioned, with regard to the deficiency of aldosterone. But it could also be from a lack of ACTH, which would be a secondary, or from a lack of CRH, which would be a tertiary. And Addison's disease, one of the symptoms, one of the signs that you actually will see will be darkening of areas on the skin or in the mucosa. And you can see that very prominently on the gum line of this person that has Addison's disease. And the reason that you get this is because when you have less cortisol, the negative feedback for that system will produce more ACTH. But it's technically not just ACTH, it's also this melanocyte stimulating hormone, which then stimulates the production of additional pigmentation. And that's why it's one of those signs that you will actually see, in addition to things such as increased infections and low blood pressure. Now, as with thyroid diseases, where I had primary, where the problems with the gland, secondary, a problem with the anterior pituitary, or tertiary, where I would have a hypothalamic problem, I can have similar issues with cortisol. I could have primary, secondary, and tertiary excess or hypercortisolism, and that would show up because I have these because I have this negative feedback system. Primary will show an increase in cortisol only, but negative feedback will mean decreases in both CRH and ACTH. Secondary will show an increase in both ACTH and cortisol, and tertiary an increase in all three. Similarly, for the deficiency, where I can have primary, secondary, or tertiary, you will see in the primary that you'll have decreased cortisol only and increased, because of the negative feedback, ACTH and CRH production. Secondary, it would start with the anterior pituitary, so you would have decreased ACTH and decreased cortisol with an increase in the CRH. And in tertiary disease, you would have a decreased level in all three, because the cortisol decrease is because of the ACTH decrease, which is because of the decrease in the CRH. Now, the zona reticularis produces androgen type hormones, and DHEA is the more prominent one of that, which has multiple androgenic or masculinizing effects. We'll talk about this when we talk about reproduction in terms of sexual characteristics. The feedback control on this is not well understood, like it is for the first two layers producing aldosterone and cortisol. But you can see in this picture actually here, this is an androgenization such that you get fairly ambiguous genitalia. Now, I mentioned before that you have the ability to make these steroid hormones in different layers. And this is a picture that actually shows the synthesis of various steroid molecules. They all start with cholesterol, and there are various enzymes that you see listed here in these rectangular boxes. So a 17-alpha hydroxylase, a 17-20 lyase, a 21 hydroxylase. All of these are enzymes that will end up producing the molecule of interest. So you can see at the very top that you have aldosterone, next down corticosterone, and then cortisol. You have the sex hormones, which we'll talk about when we talk about reproduction, down in the bottom. And one of the ingenious ways that the cortex actually determines what is produced in what layer is the presence of certain enzymes and the absence of others. So for example, you cannot make without the 17-alpha hydroxylase cortisol because you lack that enzyme to actually enable you to go over to cortisol. Now, as I mentioned before, the adrenal gland also has the inner medulla, and the medulla actually derives from a neuroectoderm, from a different type of embryonic tissue. And it is, if you remember in the sympathetic nervous system, the only thing that is going to be stimulated solely as a sympathetic nervous system as its key, and it will produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. It produces some other hormones. There's a pre-pro enkephalin, which ends up becoming enkephalin, which is one of the body's opioid-like molecules for pain relief. So I hope this has given you an overview of the adrenal glands, and they're very vital glands in our body and part of this chemical communication control system that we have. As always, if you enjoy these videos and you wish to subscribe, please do so, and then you will know when additional videos are uploaded. You're welcome to like or comment on this, and I will see you soon in Science and Medicine.